Which Wizard 101 school should you choose in 2024? It's a question we've all had starting out, and in this video I'll be using my depressing thousands of hours of experience to give you an overview of what all these schools do, how they fit into a team, and how good they are at tearing through solo PvE content relative to their peers. Let's start with a school that's not in the best spot these days, ICE. ICE has aged terribly over the last few years, and I gave them way too much slack in my 2022 class guide because they've sucked for a while now. ICE's main shtick is tanking. They have high HP and resistance, so their job is to go in first and take hits. The problem is that other schools can do this too. The three main competitors to the tank/support slot of a duo, Death, Life, and Balance, all provide so much more than ICE does in terms of utility and flexibility while not losing out in the health and resistance departments. All ICE can really do is take hits using their high HP and resistance, and while they're good at being tossed around, it's just not enough anymore to be an amazing tanking option in a meta context, especially because health and resistance aren't actually the most important factor when you're tanking. Wizard 101 is not a traditional MMO where one big beefy tank goes in and generates all the aggro anymore. While ICE can kind of do this for the first half of the game, most enemies level 90 and up are going to be spamming spells that attack everybody in the duel. These are called AoE spells, and since they make up such a large amount of a late game boss's arsenal, ICE struggles to do their job properly since those great tanking stats they have don't protect anyone other than themselves, and your entire team dying but you would mean you've lost in a tougher fight or dungeon. A school like Life that helps alleviate damage in the form of constant massive heals, or one like Death that can debuff enemy damage with spells like Virulent Plague and Juju, both do a much better job of protecting the team than an ICE wizard can. Utility trumps stats, and ICE doesn't have much of it, aside from one spell, Legion Shield, which drops a 45% shield on all allies. And that's decent, don't get me wrong, but when it's all the relevant util you've got, you're a bit outclassed here. They're also one of the worst solo schools right now. Again, don't get me wrong, they can survive fights fine with that bulk, but due to their unbelievably terrible damage output until level 108, ICE wizards quest through the game at a snail's pace. Trust me, I've done it before. Wiz gameplay is already slow enough as it is, and playing ICE makes it such a drag it can straight up suck the fun out of the game at times. I've been bashing ICE for a bit here, and this would normally be the part where I go over some good qualities, so here goes. Snowball Barrage is pretty good. I mean, again, you get it at level 108 and you're stuck with the worst AoE spells in the game until then. Seriously, they get two back-to-back AoEs and they're both just miserable. It's embarrassing that they're even in the game at all. The somewhat new system of Arc Mastery throws them a bone, allowing them to cast heals from other schools more efficiently or become a tankier but softer hitting version of Death, which is depressingly effective for late game soloing. Lastly, let's summarize the goods and bads of ICE here. For positives, they've got the highest resistance and second highest HP of any school in the game right now, making them the tankiest overall based on pure defensive stats. Snowball Barrage is a strong hit once you get it, and they make great use of Death and Life Arc Mastery. As for cons, they're a ruthlessly slow school due to their weakest in the game firepower, and their niche of being the tank doesn't really translate to being a meta pick due to the lack of identity that provides in a non-traditional MMO like Wiz nowadays. They also have a noticeable lack of utility compared to their more support-based competitors. It may sound like I'm being harsh here, but ICE was the school I grew up playing as a kid and was the first school I ever got to max level. It's depressing to see just how far they've fallen over the years. Can you run a support build fine in most fights as ICE? Yeah. Can you solo the game on ICE? Dreadfully, but still. Yeah, you can still play the game and beat all of the main quests fine as ICE, whether it's in solo or group play, just not optimally or quickly. Wiz PvE isn't that picky anyway, so don't sweat the meta too much. Play it if you like the aesthetic and don't mind suffering as a solo player, but if you're looking for a school with a bit more utility that's duoing with a hitter, I'd recommend something else. On a bit more of a positive note, we've got Storm, who aside from occasionally being replaced by Deaths using Storm spells in PvP, is in a good spot these days. Storm is the big damage school. They hit hard, having the highest spell damage and damage dealing stats out of all the schools, but this strength comes at a cost. Their defenses suck for most of the game. They are statistically the frailest school in both HP and resistance, making them the full-fledged glass cannon option in Wizard 101. However, this poor tankiness isn't as big of a deal as it seems, especially for soloing. Sure, if you're soloing, it can often be a struggle to take down bosses before they defeat you, but there's no punishment for losing a duel in Wizard 101. You just walk right in and try the fight again. This lack of consequence results in Storm being a deceptively solid solo school once you get the ball rolling. Because of Wizard 101's lack of defeat punishment, and because of Wizard 101's monthly subscription-based service, and because this is an MMO where you need to grind select bosses many times over, speed is arguably the most important attribute a school can have, not just in soloing, but in team play as well. And Storm has the highest damage per pip at 125, making them the fastest and strongest of the three hitting schools you could pick, especially once you hit level 28 and get your hands on Tempest, arguably the best AoE spell in the game due to its strength and versatility. Tempest doesn't cost a set amount of pips like most other spells. Instead, it gobbles up whatever pips you have at the time and does 80 damage per pip, whether that's 1 pip or 14. Basically, it can nuke, kill mobs quick, farm bosses, do anything you or your team could need, a real Swiss Army knife of a hit. In terms of utility, Storm's primarily revolves buffs around increasing their own damage even further, particularly in the form of the supercharged spell, which creates a damage buff on the player that increases by 10% with every pip used to cast it. Yeah, you can cast up to a 140% buff on yourself if you feel like it, though it's not the most useful outside of achievement hunting. Enfeeble is an initially useful utility spell that can break all of an enemy's blades for 3 pips, although Storm doesn't make the best use of this since your goal is to hit and kill enemies as fast as possible without taking any detours. Healing Current is Storm's only innate healing spell, and while it's nice to have, the card's not often used in general questing aside from boss solo strats that demand a 2-hit kill setup. The real utility of Storm comes from hitting and killing. In fact, as we segue into the pros and cons summary section, all of Storm's pros stem from that colossal damage. They're a fantastic option for group play due to that peerless damage dealing ability that also results in a quick and snappy solo questing experience despite a bit of a slow start. Their lowest in the game bulk and accuracy can make early game soloing difficult and unreliable, but once you gain access to spells like Tempest, Glowbugs, and Stormlord, along with the first solid gear set at level 30, you're gonna have a quick and mostly painless time in any manner of play if you know the game's basics. Storm is the premium damage dealing school at this moment in time in both speed and strength. Just be a bit nicer to people though. Storm players get a bad rap for being generally insufferable in dungeon queues, and no other school has this stigma. I don't care if you have the 1 in a million badge on, you're not that guy, pal. Moving on to hitting school number 2, we've got the good old Fire School. Fire, much like Storm, is a hitting school designed to end fights quick while soloing or take up the hitting role in a group. And statistically, Fire does a good job of this. They've got the second highest damage per pip on their spells with an even 100, which should translate to them being a solid hitting option alongside Storm, right? Well, not exactly. See, Fire's main shtick is this damage type known as damage over time spells, or dots for short. And since I just finished talking about how important speed is while going over the Storm School, I think you can see the problem here. You don't want damage over time, you want damage now. Let's take a look at the spell Fire Dragon to illustrate this point. Fire Dragon is Fire's 7-pip AoE, which is without doubt the most used spell in the game for every school over the course of a playthrough. And it should be a good thing that Fire Dragon has the highest cumulative damage out of all these 7-pip AoEs, dealing 540 on impact and 435 more over the course of 3 rounds. But what works on paper doesn't always work in practice. Sure, the overall base damage is high, but one of Wizard101's 2 major damage buffs, traps, are rendered significantly less effective by this damage spread. Traps are placed on an enemy and only trigger on the initial hit of the spell when cast on said afflicted enemy, which for every school but Fire is totally fine. However, since almost half of Fire Dragon's damage triggers after its initial hit, none of that overtime damage gets those buffs. This makes Fire slower compared to schools like Storm and even Myth, because bread and butter boss slaying spells like the Feint Trap can't be used to their fullest potential, on top of already taking extra turns to begin with. For a hitter, speed is everything, and Fire doesn't have much of it relative to its peers. Since they follow Storm's lead, possessing slightly higher but still low health, a solo Fire's goal is to kill everything as fast as possible. However, due to dots being slower by design, they often struggle to kill as quickly as their stats expect them to, resulting in spotty soloing experiences. Fire does, however, have an amazing duo strategy that speeds them up with and beyond the rest of the hitters. It starts off with the Fire Wizard going first using the 5-pip AoE Scald that deals 525 damage to all enemies over 3 rounds, and then the second wizard in the duel popping the Incendiate spell to detonate this AoE, increasing its damage by 200% and having it all hit at once. This turns Scald into a weapon of mass destruction, blowing every other AoE out of the water by the damage per pip metric, and it shows. You can schwack loads of tough boss farms in just 2 to 3 turns, and it's still decently useful in single player, albeit far slower. There's just one small problem with this strategy though. You need to gamble for a piece of pack gear that grants this unique Incendiate spell, and there's no way to obtain it for free. You can either get it from Dahlia's Smoldering Hairdo, which drops from the Professor's Horde packs, or the Kroger Jewel gift cards redeemed in the months of February and August, although this jewel only allows your pet to cast it at random times, so maybe stick with the hairdo, yeah? Fire's utility is very similar to Storm's in the sense that most of it revolves around buffing damage. Spells like Fuel help navigate around the issue of traps being bad by placing 3 of them at once, which is sort of useful, sometimes. Another wacky trap spell, Backdraft, is Fire's version of Supercharge, which eats up all the user's pips and puts that percentage trap on an enemy. Yeah, you can put a 210% trap on an opponent if you really want to. It's funny and has some applicable uses in tougher boss fights, more than Supercharge in my opinion, though it works best in a duo with another Fire Wizard since it eats up loads of pips to cast. With the crazy potential oomph of Backdraft and the bustedness of Incendiate, Fire actually performs really well when dueling with another Fire, especially late game. A double Fire comp can blitz through the game like nobody's business, and I don't think Fire gets enough credit for how good it can be in optimal conditions. Moving on to the pros and cons section here, Fire's got some decent upsides. Backdraft, Scald, and Incendiate strats can make most boss grinds light work, and Raging Bull is a solid AoE once you get it, at level 108. For cons, Fire struggles to slot into just any comp and spew out damage like Storm and even Myth can due to their lack of a good reliable AoE that doesn't require a strategy built around it. Damage over time spells really lower their speed and efficiency, and a bad 7-pip AoE is always a struggle. Incendiate being exclusive to packs is really tough, and they're one of the weaker solo schools as well. All in all, Fire is an amazing hitter when Incendiate's involved and not so great otherwise. When you're able to run Incendiate backdraft strats, they're the fastest and the strongest, but unless you have a friend to run that strat with, you're out of luck. Their gimmick of damage over time just isn't that great, so hopefully the devs find a way to buff Fire up a bit since most people aren't playing with an Incendiate wielding buddy. But again, if you like the theme, you'll be perfectly fine playing Fire in any scenario. Any school can find success in this game, it's not that hard. Going from one of the worst schools in the game to the objective best, we've got Death, who with the development of Arc Mastery, went from being the best of the 7 schools to being a better version of all 7 schools individually. Need a hitter that doesn't have glass bones and paper skin without sacrificing too much damage? Just run a Death with Tempest Treasure cards and Stormlord. Need an all-around utility monster that can heal, buff, and debuff? Run a Death with Life Arc Mastery. Need a decent backup hitter with solid tanking stats and the greatest depth of debuff spells in the game? Run a Death with no Arc Mastery because they're the best school in the game anyways. This school is so good it's disgusting, but let's break down why that is beyond just a few sentences. Firstly, many of Death's hits have a unique side effect that is amazing in this game, Lifesteal. This effect is self-explanatory. You deal damage to the target and heal yourself for half that damage back. This is especially great for soloing because you don't have to worry about managing your pips or whether or not you can hit or heal in any given situation. All of that management is out the window. You press one button, do a bunch of damage, heal yourself for half of it, head empty, no thoughts required, W gaming. There's a reason most challenging bosses are easily soloed on Death characters because they're such a step above every other school in terms of pip management and fights. They're also middle of the road both offensively and defensively with just enough in every stat to hit hard and tank well. Although what makes Death stand out most in the tank slot isn't their stats, it's their utility. Death has an incredible array of useful utility spells that shine most in debuffing enemy damage. Spells like Plague and Bad Juju are both excellent at this, but Virulent Plague has got to be the most consistent protective spell in the game right now. This spell nerfs the next hit of all enemies by 40%, meaning every tick of every hit is feeling that debuff. This differs from Ice's best util spell, Legion Shield, that's susceptible to getting broken by dot hits and only nerfs one AoE hit as opposed to Virulence 4 in theory. They're both solid protective spells, but I'd take Virulent Plague's consistency over it any day. But that's not even close to where Death's util ends. You've got Bad Juju, which debuffs enemy damage by 90%, Curse that boosts damage on an enemy by 30%, Beguile that can turn enemies into allies for a turn, Dark Pact that gives 2 25% damage blades to one of your hitters, Sacrifice, which is a deceptively underrated heal, and I didn't even mention Feint yet. Is that enough Death glazing for you? This school is ridiculous to the point where it's kind of a problem. Circling back to the Arc Mastery system I mentioned earlier, I gotta elaborate more on how this change buffed Death even further. If you played a bit of Wizard101 in the past, you probably know what a pip is. Every card in the game has a number in the top left corner indicating how many pips it costs to cast. You get one every turn, and at level 10 you start getting the occasional power pip, whoa, which counts as 2 pips for your own school's spells. But with the addition of the Arc Mastery system, you can set your power pips to whatever school pips you want, allowing you to use other schools' cards more efficiently. And oh man, does Death benefit from this in the late game especially. Once Gear starts giving out actual good dual school stats, which to be fair is like level 160, you can use Storm's powerful spell damage to your own ends, giving you similar but still slightly weaker firepower compared to a full-fledged Storm character, but with the respectable Death school bulk and utility. I'd personally still have a Storm in a full team of 4, but if you're dueling with a buddy and want a school that can cover all the bases for endgame, Death is where it's at in that regard. You can switch your setup on the fly to fit any style of play the game demands. Lastly, I'm going to go over the Death school's one major weakness. They have a relatively weak early game. This is primarily due to their lack of an AoE until level 48. The game's going to feel slow for you up until that point. However, there's a bit of a fix for this problem, the Deer Knight Onyx. The recipe for random Death Onyx is sold in Marleybone. It's a cheap craft that gives you a chance at landing this jewel if you pick up crafting, which I would. You'll need it for the endgame, but you can also grab it as a drop from select Marleybone and Aquila bosses if that's more up your alley. Link in the description for the wiki page on that. Once you get this jewel, you'll want to be sure to socket it on a tier socket deck since it has no effect on your stats till later in the game, and bam, weakness somewhat nullified. Okay, so moral of the story, Death is legit broken, like nerf-worthy broken. Time to break it down to pros and cons, or let's face it, mostly pros. They've got balanced enough stats to excel at any role for most of the game. The life drain on their spells is the most powerful gimmick of any school, leading to them being by far the best solo school. They make great use of Arc Mastery, especially towards the end of the game. I know I'm glazing like the Krispy Kreme conveyor belt, but they're cracked. As for cons, they have a bit of a slow start stat-wise until level 30, and without the Deer Knight Jewel, they don't get an AoE until level 48. 28. Death is a school that is so good they actively make other schools worse in comparison, so if none of the other schools pique your interest and you're deciding solely on the meta, look no further, as long as you can tolerate the slower start. Otherwise, just be original and pick something else. There's already too many of you clowns running around as it is. Hey, just a quick aside here to say if you're enjoying the video, do me a solid and give that sub button a little tap, just like a gentle one. I'm not normally a fan of asking this, but the difference in sub gain when I do compared to when I don't is stark. So sub if you're enjoying, or don't if you're not. Either's fine. Moving on to Myth, the school I gave way too much of a hard time in my 2022 class guide. Myth is the third of the major hitting schools, and similar to Fire, they do get outclassed a bit by Storm. I won't sugarcoat that, and they have lower damage stats than Fire throughout most of the game too, though this starts to even out towards the end. But they do have one thing over all of the other schools when it comes to hitting. They have the highest burst damage 7-pip AoE in the game, which, as I said earlier, is the most used spell for most schools. To get this out of the way though, it's worth mentioning that oftentimes in group play, you're going to be relegated to a backup hitting or support role as Myth. Storm players lurk around every corner, and in most parties, they're going to get bladed over you. So train Feint, train Elemental Blade, and when you're able, hope that you get to hit when your stats are better than the rest of the team up queue. Seriously, not so pro tip here. Blade the hitter with the best damage stats, don't base it all on school. You can base some of it, just don't base all of it. In terms of utility, Myth also has innate access to some useful spells like Pierce, Shatter, and Earthquake, which all specialize in disarming opponents' blades and shields. This isn't the best or most applicable util lineup by any means, but it has some useful moments in tough boss fights. When it comes to soloing, Myth is a bit weird since they've got a couple options. The first is similar to Storm or Fire and works well enough for most fights post level 30 gear. Hit hard and hit fast. They can perform this strat decently well once Orthrus is obtained, but as I'm learning in the Myth solo run I'm streaming, it's rough early on. It feels like mobs live with a handful of HP almost every time. However, once you get Mount Olympus gear at level 30 and Orthrus at 48, soloing this way becomes significantly more manageable and stays that way for most of the game. Myth's second soloing strat comes via unique bonuses in the side mode of Monstrology. This system allows you to extract the souls of enemies and craft them into summonable allies via treasure cards, and while other schools can only summon one at a time, Myth can summon 3 to the field at once. I'm not the biggest fan of minions, nor have I delved much into Monstrology, but there's some interesting minions there that could probably help in soloing some tough fights and dungeons. Particularly, I've heard good things about the Fractal Tree Minders in the Catacombs and Adlik Lang in Chrysalis. Again, Myth can summon 4 boss level mobs to help them out. It might not always be the most necessary or efficient playstyle, but it sounds like a pretty interesting way to play late game content solo if that's your thing. Just keep in mind that Monstrology costs a lot of gold and might be a struggle to save for, especially starting since there's so many systems you need gold for. Looking at you, pet hatching. Also, it's worth mentioning that Myth gets a lot of minions early on via spell quests, but these lose their usefulness fast and aren't all that relevant for most of the game. They're fun to use in Arc 1 though, and can somewhat tide you over while you accumulate gold from Monstrology in the meantime. All in all, Myth is a weird school. They've got solid damage numbers thanks to their best in-house 7-pip AoE along with having passable bulk. They plug into random team comps well, and their utility is solid, albeit easy for other schools to use via treasure cards. Plus, they're a deceptively good solo school once they get some momentum thanks to Monstrology. As far as negatives go, they do struggle a lot during the early game, especially with soloing, and they do get generally outclassed by Storm in the primary hitting role. Not to mention, Myth is still regarded by many as a bad school, so some randos in public queues will occasionally refuse to buff you over some other schools that are less deserving at times. Despite that though, Myth is a pretty solid school all around these days, with the Orthrus buff and addition of Monstrology a few years back really giving them the identity that sorely lacked years ago. Play them if you want to have fun with Monstrology and minions, or want a heavy-hitting school that's got some fun gimmicks and strats beyond just killing fast. Next up, we've got the Life School, Wizard101's equivalent of the traditional RPG White Mage or Cleric. Healing is your job, and you do lots of it. No school trains anywhere near the amount of useful heals that Life does, nor does any other school have the capability of healing quite as much as Life does with their high incoming and outgoing stats. In a team meta context, Life's usefulness can fluctuate a bit throughout the game depending on what world you're in. In Arc 1, they're good at keeping the team up if your hitters struggle to kill. In Arc 2, they're especially amazing since bosses and enemies get so much bulkier, resulting in more drawn out fights, but Arc 3 onwards, the usefulness of healing starts to fall off a little bit. Boss and mob health is significantly lower, and most fights don't demand heals out of you. That being said, difficult dungeons and boss fights like those in Darkmoor or the Catacombs are where Life can shine in public team queues. Usually, Wizard101 teams are pretty uncoordinated, and in difficult fights, this can be both disastrous and chaotic. Perfect conditions for a Life Wizard to thrive. They can make up for bad RNG or bad team communication and fully heal the squad with relative ease, something that every other support school can't do quite as well as them. While Life is streaky when it comes to usefulness and team play, they can find significantly more use in parties full of inexperienced players, as fights tend to be longer and characters tend to be weaker when you don't know what gear to have or what strats to run. It's also worth noting that Life has the highest base HP by the end of the game and is only behind the Ice School in pure tanking stats. Life's utility is, as you might have guessed, predominantly in the form of healing and buffing healing. Spells like Guiding Light and Brilliant Light work just like damage blades, but for heals. Neither of these are overly useful in my opinion, but there's some achievement hunting you can do with them. I'd say their best non-healing supportive utility has gotta be the spell Triage that deletes damage over time effects off of any ally. I can see this getting some use in 4 stacks when you don't have a lot to do, but similar to Guiding Light, it's pretty niche. Life is an excellent solo school, one of the best out there. With their tremendous bulk and repertoire of healing spells, it's super hard to die as a Life in most cases. They do run into the same problem as Death in that they have no early AoE, so the first arc will go by slowly compared to most other schools. But once you hit level 48, you get rewarded with an excellent AoE in Forest Lord. This spell does 620 to 680 flat damage to all enemies. It's as good as a 7-pip AoE can get. No frills, no dumb gimmicks to lower the base damage output, just pure single hit damage. With the power of Forest Lord, a Life with good gear can hit similar numbers to a Fire throughout the second arc of the game, and they do this on top of having fantastic bulk and sustain. There's no doubt about it, Life is an excellent all-around solo school, especially for newer players who maybe aren't experienced enough to handle a school like Storm or Myth early on. You'll hardly be dying at all if you have the right gear. Trust me, I know, I soloed up to around level 90 on this school without dying a single time. It slaps in the soloing regard. If you like playing a supportive role in other games, you'll like the Life school, it's that simple. But let's break it into some pros and cons. Life is a support school whose excellent levels of healing are unique to them for most of the game, and access to such incredible heals makes them excellent as a solo school when it comes to sustainability. They've got similar overall survivability to Ice, but thanks to Forest Lord, they hit loads harder, resulting in little sacrifice of speed, while still being just as beginner friendly. As for cons, the lack of a convenient 4-pip AoE results in a slow start, and one of their best heals, Pigsy, is locked behind some brutal grind. Also, the usefulness of heals does fall off a smidge towards endgame. Life is a fun, beginner-friendly school that rocks in every manner of play. You can't really go wrong here. Just make sure to heal in team-up queues. I've done Darkmoor runs with Lifes that just refuse to heal, and it's kind of infuriating since, like, that's, you know, the thing they do. Last but not least, we've got the Balance School, which is a bit weirder of a class compared to the others. Balance is, much like Life, another support class, but instead of honing in on healing like Life does, they focus instead on buffing the damage of their teammates. They have access to loads of different blades and traps that buff up the damage of every school out there, making them a welcome addition to teams in theory and in practice, just not to the extent you might think. In Wizard101, your hitter doesn't need all that many blades to hit for most fights in the game, maybe 3 to 4 at most. And while Balance is good at providing those 2 to 3 supplementary blades early on, once players get access to Elemental Blade or Spirit Blade and blades provided by their gear, Balance starts to lose that exclusive utility a bit. It gets even worse once every school hits Azteca and gains access to the Sharpen spell, allowing for them to stack a buffed and unbuffed version of all their blades. At that point, any of the supportive schools, whether it's Death, Ice, Life, or even Myth, can provide enough buffing power for a hitter to get the job done, especially if they've trained Feint from the Death School. That being said, Balance's specialty isn't useless, not by a long shot. In tough dungeons like Darkmoor, Balance can stack their class exclusive blades while another support school like Ice, Life, or Death can lather up the hitter with conventional ones. This works better and better the more players there are in a duel because nobody else can cast these blades but Balance, meaning they don't have to worry about what the other supports are doing or whether or not they're accidentally throwing the same blade on a hitter as their Death School buddy over there. Balance has some solid utility aside from buffs as well. Availing Hands is a good heal and Donate Power is nichely useful at times early on. Hex is a solid 30% damage trap that can come in handy, and they also have Weakness, which is okay I guess, but it's nowhere near the impactfulness of Virulent Plague or Legion Shield as a protective spell since it only targets a single enemy. Balance isn't all support either. They've got some sneakily strong offensive firepower. Judgment, for example, is a single target hit that does 100 base damage per pip, similar to Tempest, but harder hitting and single target. This thing can do some ridiculous boss slaying damage if you save up the pips. It's a phenomenal spell that's without doubt the best single target attack available at the time you get it. Power Nova is also a fantastic 7-pip AoE, dealing 665 flat damage to all enemies. It's not too far off Orthrus and Stormlord in terms of damage. This hit's underrated if you ask me. They've also got above average HP and resistance with combined tanking stats slightly higher than Death, making them more than bulky enough to take a few hits. Now, after hearing about all the previous classes, you might be putting some pieces together here. Solid tanking stats, good healing and utility, deceptively strong AoE damage. This has gotta be a good solo school, right? Right? There are 2 main reasons that Balance struggles as a solo school. Reason number 1, while they're great at buffing others, they're not so great at buffing themselves. Their go-to blade, the Balance Blade, only buffs damage by 25%, 10% less than the other school exclusive blades. Even worse though is that they don't have access to a second stackable blade until around level 28 in Blade Storm, which only buffs by 20%. While other schools can buff themselves by 70% with their School Blade and Tri-Blade combined, Balance can only buff themselves by a cumulative 45% early on. That's a big gap that can really mess with your kill times. Reason number Number 2, they have no way to effectively deal with balanced bosses. While every other class has access to a prism to deal with bosses sharing their school, Balance doesn't. Instead, they rely on the mediocre Hydra and Chimera spells for the first 108 levels of the game, meaning you have to grind through the most tedious, dense, obnoxious worlds with no convenient boss killer. What makes these spells so bad at their job is their criminal lack of burst damage. They hit 3 separate times with 3 different elements on the turn they're cast, being unable to make effective use of feints in a way that makes Fire look like the best trap user out there. Because of these reasons, myself and many others view Balance as the worst solo school in the game. I wouldn't recommend it as a first school if you're soloing. All in all, Balance is paradoxically the school of more. The more players there are in the duel and the more difficult to fight, the more they get to shine. They're still perfectly viable and respectable in duos. Every class can be played to great effect for the entire game, so if you like the theme, go for it. If you're soloing though, maybe steer clear of this one unless you want the challenge. So yeah, that's my thoughts on the Wiz schools and where they stand at this moment in time. I personally don't love to rank schools since I think everything aside from death and first is debatable, but if you're really curious in my grain of salt rankings, here they are. This one here is for group play and this one's for soloing. Keep in mind, if you're a newer player, I'd move Ice a little higher and Storm a little lower on the soloing scale. If you're just starting the game, check out this beginner's guide I made here. It pairs well with this video, I think, although my opinions on the schools has changed since then. Otherwise, subscribe for more junk, and as always, see you guys next time.